The origin of San Diego Filipino gangs. In San Diego, the same questions were asked. Low-income whites did not form gangs even though they lived in the same neighborhoods as the Mexican-American and African-American gangs. Even more remarkable was a large population of former boat people made up of Southeast Asian refugees who were poor, had minimum English skills, and suffered minority discrimination. The discrimination was not only, or even predominantly, from the majority whites, but from established American minority groups, African Americans and Mexican Americans. They felt the Southeast Asians were encroaching on them and the scarce resources and services they had been able to obtain. Besides, they dressed, looked, and talked differently from real Americans. However, the Southeast Asians were not forming gangs to an extent documented by the police in the late 1980s, and other than isolated incidents, the refugees were considered to be law-abiding citizens like most Asian Americans. By 1990, though there were some Southeast Asian gangs, with all of the violence characteristic of the established American gangs, the same forces behind the African American and Mexican American gangs served to generate Southeast Asian gangs. It was necessary to re-enter the field in 1991 to gather more data for the completion of this work. It was not the Southeast Asian gangs that were the next group to develop, however. In 1988, when the second extended period of fieldwork was done, the Filipino gangs had become active. This is the first group we will discuss, and more than any of the other groups who formed gangs, the Filipinos are the most surprising, given their background in San Diego. The Filipino population in San Diego is connected to the military establishment and the nursing profession. A large contingent of Filipinos who served in the U.S. military, especially during the Vietnam War, was allowed to immigrate to the United States during the 1970s. Likewise, a large number of Filipino nurses immigrated to the United States during the 1970s when a nursing shortage generated a more liberal immigration policy for nurses. Thus, a typical Filipino household in San Diego contained a husband who was employed in some way by the military and a wife who was a nurse. This allowed many Filipino families to enjoy a middle-class way of life shortly after immigration, with their combined incomes and various fringe benefits the military provided for families, such as commissary and post-exchange privileges. In the elementary and secondary schools, the Filipino children were good students, and it was common to see them winning awards for good scholarship and citizenship. In the middle-class areas where Filipinos resided, they felt some discrimination by the predominantly white population, but on the whole, whites and Filipinos got along very well. The parents of whites and Filipinos intermingled in the various neighborhoods, schools, and youth sports functions that bring all suburban families together. Economically, there was equality and they shared the same problems and goals in getting the kinds of schools, parks, and other services the suburban dwellers expected and demanded. Furthermore, the Filipinos were socially and politically conservative, like much of the rest of suburbia. So while there may have been some discrimination, it was more in style than substance, and since the Filipinos posed no threat to the non-Filipinos in suburbia, there were generally good relations between them and other groups in suburban San Diego. Throughout most of the 1980s, the Filipinos were not only low in crime statistics, but no Filipino gangs were recognized by the police. However, by 1988, about 14% of all gang-related incidents recorded by the police department's gang detail involved Filipino youths, and by 1991, 18% of the drive-by shootings were by Filipino gangs. There was enough activity among the Filipino gangs that a full-time investigator was assigned to handling their cases exclusively. The gangs began in lower-income areas, where a high percentage of military families lived, and then the Filipino gang development moved north and south. The Paradise Hills area of San Diego is located directly east of National City and north of National City and Chula Vista. It is a mix of families of non-commissioned officers and working and middle-class families. The first Filipino gang in the area was called the Bidang Boys. They and a much smaller group called Da Boys were in conflict. The Da Boys gang allied themselves with a Mexican-American gang called the Paradise Hills Locos, PH Locos. The alliance led to the shooting death of one of the beat-down boys by members of the PH Locos. There was retaliation against the PH Locos, and the feud seemed to end there. By 1991, the PH Locos were in an ongoing fight with the Setentas in Lomita Village, another Mexican-American gang. Later, a larger rival Filipino gang called Bahala na Bacarda formed in Paradise Hills. It identified with the African-American gang color blue and was considered a Crip faction of the Filipino gangs, even though there was no connection between the Filipino and African-American gangs. The beat-down boys chose red and identified as a blood faction. Two other Filipino gangs active in 1988 were in the South Bay areas of Nestor and Del Sol. The South Side Blood operated in the Del Sol area and in the eastern part of the South Bay, and the South Side Posse operated in the Nestor area between Imperial Beach and Del Sol. The socio-economic makeup of these areas was similar to Paradise Hills, and each gang took on an identification with the blood and Crip names and colors. However, like all other Filipino gangs that adopted the African-American gang names and colors, there was no connection between Filipinos and blacks. The final two groups that came to be Filipino gang rivals were the North Side Blood and the Ruthless Posse Crips. Was in the relatively affluent middle-class suburb of Rancho Peñasquitos, and the Ruthless Posse Crips resided in an adjacent suburb to the south called Mira Mesa. Mira Mesa was a mixed middle-class area adjacent to the Miramar Naval Air Station in the north part of the city. Because of the large Filipino population, the subdivision was sometimes referred to as Manila Mesa. However, the Filipinos were a minority there and had the same general acceptance as elsewhere in San Diego. Many of the Filipino families moved from Mira Mesa north to Rancho Peñasquitos as they became more affluent. As a result, there were many family connections among Filipinos between the two suburban areas. Most of the information on the Filipino gangs indicates that while they took on the names and colors of the African American gangs, they tended to take on the general behavioral patterns of the Mexican-American gangs. Their major criminal activities seemed to be gangbanging and drive-by shootings. They were not known to be involved in drug sales or robberies, and there did not appear to be a major interest in car theft, as was the case with Southeast Asian gangs that developed later. In interviewing Filipino gang members, we found the same general patterns of behavior characteristic of Mexican-American and African-American gangs. The following interview excerpts with a member of Bahala na Bacarda illustrate the similarity. Our rivals are beat-down boys, bloods. We fight against them, gangbang. The only time we fight is when we run into each other, or we may look for revenge against them. We are not mainly known for selling drugs. Only some of us sell drugs. Most members just drink. There are about 300 guys in our gang. A lot of our members have normal jobs, or we get money from our parents. About a quarter of us dropped out of school. The rest of us attend school on a regular basis. I was known for not attending school. On an average day, I would leave my house as if I was going to school, but I would end up at a friend's house instead. Back then, my friends were more important. We would kick it or go to a girl's house, someone that also ditched or had already graduated, and do whatever. Sometimes we would drink or smoke weed. We would drive around, not necessarily looking for trouble, but sometimes we would run into guys from other gangs. Most of the time, we had guns in the car. If they outnumbered us, we would shoot at them. If they shot at us first, we would duck and hide and try to shoot back if we had a gun. Our gang is known for having a lot of guns, yet we don't like to carry them in the car because we get pulled over a lot for looking suspicious. Having a lot of kids in the car. We most keep our guns at home. On special occasions, we do carry guns, like when we know something is going to go down. Note the contradiction in the statement. They consider us like the Crips. We fight bloods, yet we dress more like a Mexican gang member, similar to the Cholo style. Some dress like a black gang member. We dress however we feel like. There's no absolute certain way to dress. The hierarchy is made up of OGs, original gangsters, the older heads, and then the juniors, the new kids. About the only possible difference between Filipino gangs and the other gangs is the percentage estimated by the interviewee to have dropped out of school. Without exact figures, it is difficult to say, but the other gangs seem to have a higher dropout rate among the hardcore members. Otherwise, the routines of the Filipino gangs mirror those of the other gangs in San Diego.